In the year 1917, on March the 8th, the Empire of Russia was shaken to its core as the proletariat class enacted a coup to overthrow the Romanov dynasty by which they would finally seize power for the people. These events would come to be known as the February Revolution, a massive milestone in the greater Bolshevik revolt. The aim of these actions was to implement a communist government where there are no dominating classes and the means of production were put squarely in the hands of the worker. 20 years later, another revolution occurred. Walt Disney released his first theatrical film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This was the movie that officially put animation on the map as a legitimate art form. From this, many were inspired to further the medium of animation and shape the future of feature films. This brings us to 1997, exactly 80 years after the proletariats began to dismantle the Romanovs' rule and 6 years after the government the Bolsheviks had built finally collapsed under its own weight. Yet another failed state made their first and ultimately fatal gasp for air. Under the crushing control of the Walt Disney Corporation at the height of its Renaissance era, many other animation studios scratched and clawed to make their names known. One of these was 20th Century Fox Animation. Not exactly the heaviest hitter, but they had an ace up their sleeve. Beyond DreamWorks or any other studio at the time, only one man had the skill, vision, and finesse to challenge Joe Roth and the directors at Disney. That man was Don Bluth, a renowned animator whose films now carry a certain prestige just by bearing his name. In 1979, he left Disney to form his own studio. It was Bluth taking the means of production into his own hands, but much like the Soviet Union, too much meddling and squabbling within Bluth's camp led to a steady decline. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and imminent collapse was clear for the USSR. This also marks the release of All Dogs Go to Heaven, and the writing on the wall began to show itself for Mr. Bluth. Don bled his way through the 90s until he was contracted by 20th Century Fox to put their studio on the map and save his own career by releasing a film to rival that of Disney in scope, scale, and box office returns. The proletariats tried to revolt and just ended up becoming a corrupt empire like the Romanovs. Don Bluth left Disney to bring animation back to its roots, and by the end of the millennium he found himself becoming the same bloated, soulless creator he swore to work not to be. Cracks formed in the Soviet Union early, with rumors of one remaining Romanov permeating the streets of Moscow and beyond for the rest of the century, giving hope to the impoverished Soviets that someone would reclaim the throne and usurp Stalin and his ilk. What a dark coincidence it is that the fall of two of the 20th century's most influential powerhouses came at the hands of the last of the Romanov line, the Grand Duchess herself, Anastasia.
In the dark of the night, evil will find her. In the dark of the night, terror comes true.
Doom. My dear, here's a sign. It's the end of the line.
In the dark of the night. In the dark of the night.
Come, my minions, rise for your master. Let your evil shine.
In the dark of the night.
Find her now, yes, fly ever faster.
In the dark of the night. In the dark of the night. In the dark of the night.
She'll be mine.
Okay, so that's a somewhat serious intro, but I just really wanted to set the scene well. I don't want this video to be droning on and on about how Anastasia isn't historically accurate to Russia's history, but I do want to bring up the estranged relationship this film has to that. So let's do a very brief recap of some things that don't quite match up. First things first, Princess Anastasia fucking died and died hard. The myth of Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna being alive was an old wives' tale told in the hellscape that was post-Lenin Soviet Union. Anastasia died in 1918 at the age of 17, which is weird history thing number 1. The film opens up on the October Revolution that happened in 1917, and Anastasia appears to be like 8 since 10 years have passed when we start the film proper, I guess? I don't know, this is a forgivable age shift since, it's a kid's movie, so live and let the final heiress of a tyrant live, I guess. It is odd that the Winter Palace is just abandoned, though. After the throne was abdicated and the Dumas were overthrown, the palace served as a museum to extol the virtues of the proletariats. So I don't get why they didn't play to that aspect in this movie or just not use the palace altogether. Why the fuck is no one here except Dmitri and Vlad? Never mind, this place is fucking haunted. On a more gross note, let's talk about how the film portrays the Romanovs. So, the Romanov dynasty was overthrown for a reason. They were bloated, abusive, and insane. I mean, the Romanovs were the most prestigious, beloved, and fair monarchy to ever exist. Tsar Nicholas II was an honorable man who did nothing wrong except love his people too much. Thank you for those 20 rubles. Overall, the weirdest historical liberty taken by this movie is that of actual guy who actually lived in the actual real world, Grigory Rasputin. I don't feel like any of you actually needed to hear this, but Rasputin was not a level 87 Chaos Necromancer who wielded an attuned crystal staff and used his dark powers to overthrow the Romanovs. Again, you probably knew this, but the Anastasia wiki made it a point to remind you just in case you were born on an Alabama homeschool short bus. Long story short, Rasputin basically invented the phrase "pimpin' ain't easy." He was a dirty, crazy man who convinced Tsar Nicholas that he was a holy prophet and healer by helping out his hemophilic son. He soon wormed his way up the social ladder and slinked right up the dress of Tsar Nicholas's wife.
Allegedly.
He's also one of Russia's most controversial figures, which is also a long story I don't feel like getting into. Simply put, he was a weirdo, the Tsar loved him, everyone else hated him, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's our super quick, super broad overview of my main issues of how basic Russian history is portrayed. But hey, like I said, this is a kids movie. We don't need a one-to-one portrayal of one of the most important events of the 20th century just to tell a good old-fashioned fairy tale. Now, don't get me wrong, that's a completely valid take to have, but here's the problem. Even as a fairy tale princess story for babies, Anastasia fucking blows. It's like a layered sheet cake of dick sucking. It's insane. Everything from casting to animation to basic plot structure is a mess. So let's stop wasting time and just get it over with. Now, I know animation like I know Russian history, and there is a reason I haven't pursued a degree in either. But I've watched this movie about 6 times in the last month for this video, so I am the Anastasia authority. And if you want to argue with me, repeat exactly what you're going to comment under this video to your mom, and come back to me after she beats your ass for being a fucking disappointment. Because goddammit, I got a fucking PhD in Anastasia. What am I going to do with that? This fucking economy! By far the most noticeable thing and common question I've heard from friends who I've subjected to watching Anastasia is, why does it look like that? Personally, I chalk it up to the fact that Don Bluth could not fucking draw people in the 90s. Most of Bluth's great films focused on anthropomorphic animals since he had a way of drawing really expressive characters in this super cartoony fashion of his. But you get to Thumbelina and dear god, everyone looks like a Barbie doll and moves like muscle atrophy. Anastasia has this issue in spades. The animation actually hits a point where it looks too fluid, but also not fluid enough. But also just smooth enough to not be cartoony. It's a weird thing to pick up on, since during your first watch you'll think, oh, this looks weird and I don't know why. Then you start to realize this strange rotoscoping on some characters, specifically Anastasia, Dmitri, and the Dowager Empress. The way they move on screen gives you this uneasy feeling when you see a more cartoony character like Vlad right next to them. Perfect point of contrast is when they do the Once Upon a December sequence and almost immediately followed up with In the Dark of the Night. Anastasia is animated in a very grounded yet light and floaty way. She maneuvers realistically like how someone dancing would move, and I genuinely love it. This is my favorite part of the movie by far, and then they do Rasputin's song and he's bouncing around like he's in fucking Hercules. And there it is. Let's get down to brass tacks and address the issue up front. Prevailing wisdom for years was that Anastasia is a Disney ripoff, and that is one of the major reasons as to why it fails to reach any discernible level of quality. I'm not gonna dispute this since, yeah, it's pretty fucking blatant, but I think there's more to the idea of this film being a Disney knockoff to look into. So frequently through this video, I'm going to make reference to the Disney movies released during the production period of Anastasia, those being 1995's Pocahontas, 96's Hunchback of Notre Dame, and finally June of 97's Hercules. I think it's important to focus on these three films since they're the most emblematic of what Anastasia feels like it's emulating. Purely on a visual level, you see elements shine through fairly quickly. The way Anastasia is animated and designed kind of looks like a logical midpoint between Pocahontas and Esmeralda. She has that graceful animation of the former, but she actually moves a lot more like the latter with very bouncy actions that look odd when combined. This clash of styles is distinctly apparent in the face region since it feels like Don Bluth wanted to pretty up Anastasia to look like Pocahontas, but the issue with that is Pocahontas is an emotionless mannequin, so it feels like he tried to inject some of Esmeralda's expressions into a lifeless model, and dear God, she looks like a fucking homunculus at some points. Ugh, it's the crease. I don't know why it's there, but it's here to stay. Dimitri has pretty much the same problem. He's drawn to look handsome and cool up close, but he has no personality to his motions. He just feels like white man who dance. God, I wish that were me. If we want to go back to the earlier Hercules comparison, take a look at some of these Rasputin freakouts. If he had just a little bit of blue flame up there, you'd be mistaken for thinking Hades, Lord of the Underworld, started life anew as that weird friend your dad has who shares his vaguely racist opinions on NASCAR and air conditioning units. Just take one step back and look at Limbo. It strikes a shocking resemblance to the underworld if it just lacked all of the charm that came with that. Which is weird because the backgrounds in this movie are really fucking good. I love the idea of using early 20th century Russia as a backdrop since Russian architecture is a fascinating marvel and was criminally underutilized in animation at this point. Problem is, the movie decides to leave Russia about a third of the way in and enters the gentrified Shire? Yeah, East Germany is looking pretty good considering the fact this is post-World War I pre-upfucking Deutschland. It just feels like visual whiplash, which I guess is kind of the point. But that's like saying I did my job since the point of me coming to this Home Depot was to get 30% off light bulbs by any means. Yeah, I ended up succeeding, but that was at the cost of taking an extra 3 inches from Big Hank in the family bathroom. I got what I wanted, but I don't feel like a hero. In a more cohesive way, I don't care if this aesthetic right turn was intentional since it causes more problems than it actually solves. Since in our last act, Paris has this really bizarre vibe to it that, again, does not mesh well with our previous settings. Now, yes, I understand that these are 3 very different parts of Europe and the backgrounds convey this visually rather than having to explain it to you, but again, take for example Hercules. Olympus, Thebes, and the underworld are all incredibly different in both architecture and color temperature. They have their own distinct identity while still gelling well in the art style. Anastasia feels like they're jumping into a different movie between each scene change. Last thing I want to talk about visually before moving on is the CG. It's gross. At some points it looks pretty decent, and hey, I'm not expecting the world out of late 90s CGI. But when it looks out of place, it really looks out of place. The best example, bar none, is this fucking music box. It's just floating there. Look at it. Gaze upon this trans-dimensional music box that will be the crux of this film's plot. Observe how grossly it's suspended in midair. It's yucky. I don't like it. Although, credit where credit is due, there are sometimes they use CG for backgrounds to more effectively utilize camera movement. And they create some pretty dynamic shots with that. But it doesn't forgive the... It's so gross. I don't like the music box. I've had like 3 nightmares about the fucking haunted Anastasia music box. This movie's doing psychic damage to me. I'm fucking done with it. I was gonna end this by saying, why even use CG? It looks ugly, but honestly, when they use it right, they nail it. I want to extend my question to be, why not use traditional animation on such simple props? It just feels so odd to have certain objects be weighty in CG compared to the floatiness of our main characters' animations. Speaking of our main characters, let's talk about one of the most infamous things about this movie. Its cast. Celebrity voices in animated films are nothing new, especially in this day and age. It's almost weird to not have them actually. Robin Williams' role as the genie is often credited as the spark that Shrek eventually turned into a wildfire by the early 2000s in regards to films being sold off the backs of their celebrity casts. In between mildly tasteful and woefully shameless, leaning more towards the latter, is Anastasia. This film's cast is the most thrown together mid to late 90s conglomerate I've ever seen. It's so bizarre since Meg Ryan, John Cusack, Christopher Lloyd, Kelsey Grammer, and Angela Lansbury star in an animated movie about the Communist Revolution sounds like a cold open off The Critic.
Come on, there's gotta be something in there better than this. That'll work. Go, go, go! What do they teach you in those orphanages?
It stinks.
But yes, just before her role in seminal GeoCities classic You Got Mail, Meg Ryan stars as our princess in training what has to be the result of the most boring game of Mad Libs ever played. If I'm being honest, I do actually really like most of this cast, but it lives and dies off our 2 leads, and spoiler alert, it dies hard. Ryan and Cusack just feel like charisma vacuums in this movie. While on one side you have Doc Brown hamming it all the way up, and on the other side you have Kelsey Grammer carrying this whole enterprise on his back cause he's a fucking professional, Anastasia and Dimitri just convey absolutely nothing. Now, I'm not one who wants to get all uppity about what kind of actors can play what roles, but in this movie Dimitri and Anya are supposed to both be 18. Meg Ryan was in her mid-30s at this point, and John Cusack was not far behind. This is fine if they had the range to pull off playing someone a bit younger, but again, the issue is that they don't. Meg Ryan was about 36 in 1997, and she sounds every bit of it. Same goes for my man John. Plus, the way they were written was explicitly made to replicate the rom-com style dialogue that Meg Ryan was known for. Problem is, both her and Cusack do not have any voice setting other than being a smug asshole.
Fine, I'll be quiet. I'll be quiet if you will.
All right, I'll be quiet.
Fine.
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 I hate myself and want to die.
A story like this calls for a range of emotions to back up the petty back and forths. If we see a more sensitive side of our characters or just something besides this one-note banter, then when the bands come back in full swing, it's a more refreshing experience. Without that, we have what this film delivered, which are paper-thin and unlikable romantic leads whose whole relationship feels contrived. Also, a small note, why is it some characters have Russian accents while our leads are the whitest of white Americans? I just wish they'd pick one, either go all in one way or the other. I don't give points out for centrism. It feels like a major portion of this film's $53 million budget went towards the casting. The movie made its money back fairly easily and doubled it as well. I really wanted to make a joke about how much this movie cost to make, but it's fairly normal. So I guess I'll just let it slide that they spent $53 million making this film that just so happened to lionize the perfect and loving Romanov dynasty and the upper class of Russia's pre-revolutionary golden age.
No, God damn it! This is bourgeois propaganda! Hang the parasites, all power to the workers!
If we flip it around and look at the singers they got to do everyone's numbers, I'm actually fine with most of them. I find it comical that Liz Calloway does all of Meg Ryan's songs, since I feel like most people would maybe recognize her from her part in singing Holding Me from the Italian animated disaster Titanic. The legend goes on. Yes, the one with the rapping dog, thank you for asking. Other than that funny tidbit, nobody does a good enough or bad enough enough job to warrant any discussion, except for the MVP, my boy, Kelsey Grammer, back at it with the HMS Pinafore Jams, because like I said before, he's a fucking professional. He came to work.
Lad, how could you do this? How will we get through this? I never should have let them down.
While I'm on this kick, let's take a minute to discuss something deathly serious. Let's talk about musicals. The musical may be the gayest form of self-expression, but I'd be damned if they weren't some of the most fun pieces of media to consume and discuss. A good musical does one of three things. It either A, gives you a well-acted narrative with characters you care about, B, leaves you with some catchy show tunes that never really exit your subconscious, or C, dazzle you with special effects and stage magic. Truly great musicals will do all three, but frankly, this is a rarity. Phantom of the Opera is the quintessential musical, since while it may not be as good as some other shows that your snobby theater friend wants you to go see, it is a crowd pleaser. It's got pretty much everything I just described going for it, so it's a no-brainer as to why it's still held as the gold standard for Broadway's finest. Animated musicals are a bit different, since while you lose the advantage of having the performance take place in the same room as the audience, you do gain an infinite number of possibilities to tell your story and choreograph your numbers in a unique and creative manner. Hunchback of Notre Dame is especially good at this with its moody lighting, soaring skylines, and grandiose scale. The information of the plot and the mood of the scene are all experienced through both its set pieces and its music. Here is where I can kind of pin down a major fault of Anastasia. It feels incoherent. This will become more apparent when we move on to talking about plot, but suffice it to say, Anastasia being a mediocre musical does so much harm to it, it's insane. This movie just tries to suck the life out of all of its numbers by either doing something that was previously done in a Disney film, or doing something unique but is boring or just plain bad. A great example is Learn to Do It, which I think is the worst song in the movie by a pretty wide margin. It just feels like a cheap reproduction of something you'd see out of The King and I or My Fair Lady, which, fun fact, Anastasia started production with the idea of adapting one of those two films, but was later changed to imitate Pygmalion's plot, with Anya being trained and being a noblewoman. The other worst song candidate is probably Paris Holds the Key to Your Heart, which sonically is just an absolute mess, but from a choreographic standpoint presents a wholly new issue. I wouldn't say it's bad choreography, in fact I think it's pretty good for a stage show. The way characters move is very Broadway, but this is an animated movie and the possibilities are endless. If you want a good contrast of what this scene could look like, I'd say Prince Ali from Aladdin fits the bill pretty well. They are both going for this manic party energy, and while Anastasia's has nice dancing in it, look how alive Aladdin is. There's so much kinetic energy on screen, it gets you right in the mood that it's trying to impart. That's honestly what Anastasia's musical numbers lack. Energy. They just replicate what we've seen before but miss the part about setting a scene or keeping a cohesive tone. Going back to it, Once Upon a December is my favorite scene since it has a somber atmosphere but radiates this sense of warmth, and the way it uses the space of the ballroom to do this is perfect. Conversely, In the Dark of the Night is probably the most memorable track since Jim Cummings absolutely kills it, but it's also kind of tonally lost. It'd sound even better in a different movie is what I'm saying. Like, yeah, A Villain Song is supposed to be the darker and audibly diverse track, but if you compare it to, say, Be Prepared, which is another Jim Cummings performance, you can still see how that song fits into the wider track list of The Lion King, when all of Anastasia's songs just sound kind of random. Even their placement is pretty peculiar and oddly spaced, since you go from one song immediately to the next without any actual plot or character progression happening to justify it. This is emblematic of a wider problem I'll talk about later, but it also affects how the story is conveyed to the audience, and hoo boy, what a story it is. The long and short of it is, the reason Anastasia gives me a fucking hernia is because the story moves so far, but nothing happens in it. It feels so hollow when you watch it. Just shit happens and it stops, I guess. It's an incredibly confused movie in many places, but its plot is the smoking gun here. Don Bluth has said that he wanted Anastasia to be more of a romantic comedy, and he could have actually pulled it off if it weren't for that motherfucker Rasputin. Rasputin, being the villain that he is, effectively breaks any opportunity this movie had for having an engaging story. Anastasia is so grounded in realism, and the post-revolution setting gives it some needed drama and a good frame of reference to work with. Then it introduces Rasputin as a fucking undead lich, and just... why? Rasputin's agency within the plot is so convoluted and yet so not there. At some points, honestly not even worth thinking about, because when you ask yourself, okay, well, why is Rasputin here? The movie interjects itself and says, oh, well, he hates the Romanovs. And you go, okay, well, what does he want to do? And they go, oh, well, he wants to kill the Romanovs. And then you say, okay, but why? And they say, oh, because they betrayed him. And it's like, okay, well, how? And then the movie says, oh, it doesn't really matter. And you go, okay, well, what happens if he kills the Romanovs? And the movie says, oh, well, the curse is fulfilled. And you say, okay, but what does that mean? And the movie just looks at you and blinks and says, the curse is fulfilled. And then you ask, okay, well, I get that, but what does the curse being fulfilled actually mean? And the movie stares at you blankly for 3 seconds and then just kind of walks away. Plus, let's not mention that he knew Anastasia was alive the entire 10 years since he died. You remember how Hades didn't know about Hercules being alive until he started making a name for himself as a hero? That was dumb because Hades is the Lord of the Dead and could have checked at any time. This is way dumber because there seems to be no reason given for why Rasputin couldn't have just ended Anastasia earlier. I flat out don't understand what the endgame is here. Come on, Rasputin, explain yourself. Explain your goal to the class. Like, Rasputin has this big plan to kill Anya and complete the curse that he goes on and on about, but our heroes don't even know that he exists until the last 10 minutes of the movie, so there's no real tension between our protagonist and antagonist. Once more, gonna drag Hercules into this and show how this could have maybe worked. So, Hercules knows Hades as a general concept, and Hades eventually learns that Hercules is alive. With that information, Hades tries to fuck with him, but instead ends up building up his credibility, and once Hercules begins to actually be a threat to his plans, Hades steps in and uses Meg as a bargaining chip. So not only does their proxy rivalry further the plot, but it also gives them a proper build-up to escalate their way towards their final confrontation. In Anastasia, Rasputin derails a train, gets butt mad and hangs out for a week, and then just turbo shits himself to fistfight a teenager in Paris. It falls so fucking flat and leaves no impact. Some people are under the impression that Rasputin is a great villain because his song is such a slapper, but if you actually add up the total amount of screen time he has, you come to find out that he's barely in the damn movie. This shit just throws me for a loop, and I don't understand how they could have made this character work. His magic horse shit is so out of place. The best way to make him fit into this plot is just to completely cut him out. If the plot centered around Anya trying to escape Russia while being hunted by, like, the Russian government or something, all the while attempting to remember her past and reunite with her grandmother, it might work. The conflict is woven into itself, so there's no need for a big and scary wizard man. I know this plot could work since it's what they did for the Broadway adaptation of Anastasia, and from what I've read, most people really liked it. But no, we needed someone so that funny Hank Azaria could do the funnies at.
Thank you, Bartok. You're my favorite.
So, okay, just remove Rasputin and the story works, right? Well, no, not really. While Rasputin is a major flaw in the worst aspect of Anastasia's story, it wasn't a very good one to begin with. It just feels bland and lifeless. Let me walk you through Anastasia's plot, but I just remove Rasputin from it wholesale and you see what I mean. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution begins to overthrow the Romanov dynasty and execute the Tsar. By some stroke of luck, the Grand Duchess Anastasia escapes, but ends up in an orphanage with amnesia. 10 years pass and our hero turns 18 and makes her way to St. Petersburg, which at this point was known as Leningrad. She then learns that there's someone named Dmitri who can help her escape Russia. Coincidentally, Dmitri and his friend Vlad are attempting to scam the Dowager Empress into believing they have brought her granddaughter back. Little does either side know that Anya is actually the Grand Duchess Anastasia, who has been rumored to be alive. Together they escape Russia with little to no issues save for the fact that the train they were on hit a Redditor on the tracks and blew up. They walk their way into Germany somehow and train Anya to be a noblewoman. They then make their way into Paris and set up a meeting with the Dowager Empress. Due to the high amount of frauds claiming to be her granddaughter, the Empress is tired and refuses to see them. Soon after, they corner her at an opera and she calls Dmitri a fraud and inadvertently exposes his scam to Anya, who ceases to trust him. After a small time apart, Anya resolves to leave France but is stopped by the Empress. Anya shows her a key in a music box and together they reminisce about their past. The Empress tells Anastasia that Dmitri refused to take the reward money, and Anastasia runs after Dmitri and they fall in love. After a bit, the two decide to leave Paris and start their new lives together. The end. That shit's fucking boring! Like, it seems like something that needs some spice to make it work. It feels like the most cookie cutter and forgettable story ever. It's like a historical romance made by Hallmark, just bare bones and bland. But whatever, this is a musical, let's just spice it up with some jams and people will forgive the shitty story. Well, like I said, the music isn't that great and the musical numbers barely service the plot. Even without Rasputin, this film still has a massive pacing problem. Anastasia has the worst kind of pacing. The one that feels like it's moving way too fucking fast, but nothing is actually happening. We have a 6-minute prologue which gives a vague idea of what's up, and then 4 songs and 26 minutes pass and our plot actually begins. Now I understand the need for an Act 1, and yeah, we can't just jump right into things, but this is a musical and we can do exposition through song. Issue is that Anastasia is absolutely front-loaded with songs and it makes the rest of the movie feel incredibly lumpy. On average, from Rumor in St. Petersburg to In the Dark of the Night, there is about a song per 6.5 minutes. But after our crew leaves Russia, the next song isn't for about 12 minutes. Following that, it takes another 14 to get to Paris Is the Key to Your Heart, and after that, shit, nothing. How much time do we have left? 25 minutes. Yeah. The reason I bring this up is because whenever I watch this, I get the intense desire to turn it off after Rasputin's number, since the last 2/3 of the film move at the speed of Romeo and Juliet Act 2 Scene 4, line 100, third word. The second they get on the train, the pacing goes from a deliberate setup to an actual death march. A major reason I feel this happens is because there are some songs that feel redundant and just cause bloat. Anastasia has 2 I Want songs in the form of Journey to the Past and Once Upon a December, with each setting up 2 different wants that are supposed to characterize Anya. The issue though is that Journey to the Past is about Anya's want to find out who she is, and Once Upon a December is about how she kind of remembers her past. If we just combined these songs, we can save precious time to further character relations like that of Anya and Dmitri. Even then, there are still massive gaps in how we go from point A to B in relation to our characters' chemistry with one another. To accept Anastasia and Dmitri's relationship to each other, you simply have to assume they'd fall in love, since that's what other stories like this also have. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Anastasia as a film only works if you have prior knowledge of other movies, which means that it doesn't work. This is the ultimate downfall of this film. Anastasia is art without identity. It has no character, it has no soul, it has no life. Every piece of art makes their mark on their medium, whether it's big or small. Anastasia barely does this. The only reason this film was remembered throughout the 2000s and some of the early 2010s was because nostalgia for Renaissance era Disney had a death grip on fans, since Disney at the time was at a low point. Yet during the mid-2010s, something happened. People stopped talking about Anastasia so highly. It went from a charming Disney-like to just nothing. Since Disney reclaimed their relevance and firmly entered its revival era, there was no need for movies like Anastasia. It just fades into the annals of history like it pissed off Stalin or something. Movies used to be sold off the back of the name Don Bluth. When you heard that name, you pictured bountiful imagination combined with limitless skill. Yet when you look at Anastasia, you see none of this. There was an attempt at trying to touch an audience with some semblance of emotion, but any hint of this is crushed under the weight of wanting to be something that could be sold to anything. It feels like the complete death of an artistic vision. It simply takes and takes because it worked for other films, so why wouldn't it work here? Even when it's trying to be original, it still feels like it's copying something. Take the scene on the boat that scarily resembles Titanic, a movie released a month after this one. Don Bluth had a chance to make a film to shirk the Disney convention, but had foregone any attempt at trying and simply had Anastasia happen. It is a final admission that he simply did not want to create anymore. His next attempt after this with Titan AE feels so needless and meaningless. A through line felt in Anastasia before it. Individual aspects of this film work on their own, but as a complete project, they utterly drop the ball in terms of meshing and creating a cohesive and palatable work of art. Anastasia means nothing, gives nothing, and is worth nothing. It is an absolute failure of the medium. Not good enough to care, not bad enough to be angry, not memorable enough to keep me thinking about it. It exists solely by its own arbitration. It just propels itself off the fact that it's a thing that happens to be real. I don't hate Anastasia because it killed Don Bluth as a creator, or that it fails in its own right as a piece of art. I hate it because I have utterly wasted my time for thinking it had any semblance of value to be critiqued or examined. So why did I make this video doing that very thing? Even if I recognize this movie as a piece of null media? Because it was fucking funny. My name is Michael. Let's talk again soon.